You're listening to The Bird Bath. This episode of The Bird Bath is brought to you by Ignite Veterinary Solutions, creators of the Veterinary Receptionist Certificate of Excellence, the VRCE. CSR Week is in April. Celebrate your front desk if you want, but if you're serious about performance, elevate it. With more than 1,000 graduates and thousands more enrolled, VRCE is becoming the standard across veterinary medicine. Graduates report greater confidence booking appointments, 82% report higher confidence in financial conversations, and 80% remain in their role, representing a 50% reduction in front desk turnover. More appointments, stronger financial conversations, greater stability. Your front desk drives your revenue. Train it like it matters. This isn't a feel-good training, it's economic performance. Join the movement. Visit vrce.vet and use the coupon code BIRDBATH25 for a special offer for VRCE General Practice, VRCE Specialty and Emergency, and now VRCE in Espanol. Welcome back to the Bird Bath. Each week we scrape the surface of the news you need to know, so let's get into it. Top story this week, we talked about it briefly at the end of last week's episode, and we did a deep dive in Thursday's newsletter, but you know it's too big to skip. The CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, handed down their big ruling. The final report dropped last week on Tuesday morning while we were all still asleep, tucked into our beds here in the US, and it wrapped up a 2.5-year investigation, and they are now in what I'm thinking of as implementation mode, right? But the big thing from this story was not just what they handed down, which I'll hit on some of those things, but since then, what have the big corporate groups, who everyone was thinking, what are they going to say? Think about what the ruling was, right? Well, ultimately, they sort of seem to be fine with it. The CVS Group, which is a huge group in the UK, their stock went up 2.6% the morning of the announcement. IVC Evidensia put out a statement welcoming the end of uncertainty. Linnaeus, Medivet, Vets for Pets, and all of the big groups roughly all said the same thing. It was one of these things that I think the fear of the unknown, or like IVC Evidensia said, the end of uncertainty, really brought people a lot more closure. Now it's just about sort of falling in line and making sure things are in a good spot. CVS put out a statement and said to their investors that the final decision does not introduce any new remedies over and above the provisional decision, which is what they had at the end of last year. So they're already sort of driving towards this. They've been working on these things. So there were no massive surprises in the way that they saw it. To give the CMA credit, they did consider some profit caps, but they decided not to go there. And they found that the big four groups made above cost of capital profits, but called uneven profitability a marker of poor competition rather than a reason for price control. Basically, they were saying, hey, these large companies are making a good amount of money, but it's not because they're doing anything untoward. It's because they're actually rising above, in the CMA's view, from what some of the other practices and practice groups are doing. The RCVS broadly welcomed the remedies, but pushed back on two things. They didn't like the publishing of the parasiticides pricing, saying that it ignores suitability and environmental factors, and they proposed governance changes to the RVC itself. They said there wasn't enough evidence to really support the CMA's recommendations or demands to change how the RCVS governs themselves. So what's actually going to happen? Well, the legally binding order from the CMA goes into effect September 23rd of this year. Large practice groups, so if you have more than 15 practices, you have 3 to 9 months to comply after that. Smaller groups have 6 to 12 months to comply. And what they have to comply with: prescription fees are capped at £21 for the first prescription and $12.50 for each additional one. You have to publish your list price online and in practice. You have to disclose corporate ownership on your website and in signage and in your communications. Written estimates are required for anything over £500. Itemized bills need to show individual meds and services. And there needs to be written clinical independence policies. So you can't have, or you have to have more so, a written policy that allows the veterinary teams to be independent from price controls or recommendations from the corporate group and allow them to practice medicine. There's a 12-month max on out-of-hours provider contracts, which is not something we have here in the US, but in the UK, a lot of these contracts for after-hours support are extremely constrained in the UK market. And then has to be a written complaint procedure. So a lot of things here, but the real teeth of it comes from the fact that the CMA is going to be the one enforcing it. So if you aren't complying, you are actually going up against the government, not just a regulatory body. These aren't things that we've seen in the US happening yet, but there are some things that are definitely worth thinking about. I've been working on mapping all of the practices here in the US and understanding what that looks like. We definitely are not on this disclosure of corporate ownership, and there's a lot of things that aren't there. Published prices are not in place, and sort of these things might trickle down or create a different type of demand from the free market here in the US. More European news, but it all ties together, people. Stick with me. Tractive, the Australian pet GPS tracker company, is being acquired by Bending Spoons, which, if you think of Bending Spoons, I'm just thinking of the Matrix all the time. But they're actually a really, really large company in Europe that does a ton of technology acquisitions. But if you're not familiar with Tractive, you probably should be. They make the wearable GPS devices and app for tracking pet location, activity, and health metrics. They've been around since 2012, and they have millions of pet owners utilizing their services globally. They're one of the bigger names in the space, and they grew last year when they acquired Whistle from Mars. The wearable market keeps sort of growing and trying to find a space in where it can thrive. We've seen that there have been lulls and peaks and valleys in just the tracking component, but a lot of people are looking at the health monitoring. So understanding activity levels, sleep patterns, calorie burn, sort of, your aura ring for your dog is what a lot of these are trying to figure out. And now as we see a growth of the ability of AI to ingest and act upon this data, we're starting to see more and more people looking at hardware solutions to increase the tracking of what's going on with their pets. For their part, Bending Spoons CEO Luca Ferrari said they'll invest significantly in Tractive for the long run. Tractive CEO Michael Hernaus, sorry Michael if I butchered your last name, says they bring capital, scaling expertise, and AI infrastructure. But what they don't tend to bring is a long-term future for the employees. So here's the thing that gets kind of interesting. Bending Spoon's a Milan-based tech company. They buy products with a good market fit, and they run them through a very, very specific playbook. You're going to know a lot of companies that they've acquired over the years. They own Evernote, Vimeo, WeTransfer, Eventbrite, Meetup, Issue, AOL, which some people probably thought I didn't know that was even around, StreamYard, and a ton of other big names. These are established products that they acquire, but after every acquisition, there's one thing that comes to fruition very quickly. The teams from the acquired companies are on the chopping block. Evernote had the entire US staff laid off. Mosaic Group, which they acquired, had 100% of the employees laid off. WeTransfer had a 75% reduction in workforce. Vimeo, which was a $1.38 billion acquisition, cited most of the staff was cut, including the entire video team. And AOL, which was acquired very recently by Bending Spoons, has laid off over 100 employees. So nothing in the press release talks about what's going on with the staff, but it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're on the Tractive team and you're thinking about, where your future lies with the new business. For their part, Bending Spoon does have a great history here of growing these businesses and continuing to get them more and more adoption. So it's an idea here of maybe we'll see some pains for the employees and the people that were at the acquired company, but hopefully they saw a really nice package in that send-off. But we'll see some increased adoption and market penetration for these wearables. And then the question is, how are we going to see people interacting with this? Are we going to start seeing more Tractive data flowing into vet clinics? Are we going to see this data being utilized as ways to increase and understand the diagnoses and how our pets are interacting outside of the clinic? There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more ability to understand what's going on. So best of luck to everyone on the Tractive team with the new parent company here, and I can't wait to see where this all goes. Someone that is nothing but smiles is the team over at Chewy. Their Q4 earnings report dropped just recently, and their stock took a great jump up by 12%. Their full year revenue was $12.6 billion, up 8.3%, and they had a record quarterly free cash flow of $232 million, which was up 48% year over year. Chewy Vet Care had great news as well. They opened 10 new clinics in 2025, and they now have 18 clinics across 5 states. CEO of Chewy, Sumit Singh, called Chewy Vet Care its fastest compounder in net sales per active customer. In their reports, they noted that it was a customer acquisition and an engagement flywheel. Another really big thing in this was that they noted that 80% of net sales were on auto ship. So these are numbers you guys have to be thinking about, right? 80% of their sales are coming through auto ship. Morgan Stanley was extremely excited about this. They made them a top pick for the vet market, and they expect to see them growing more and more practices. Pet owners as well are also looking at it. 55% of pet owners said that they were likely to consider a Chewy clinic, and 80% of pet owners under 35 said they were likely to consider a Chewy clinic. So you're not just seeing these clinics being a spot where they're growing in their footprint of veterinary services, but they're bringing that revenue out of the clinic onto the auto ship world and starting to continue to grow their footprint with those clients. So it's something that we've talked about. I know I've been harping about what our practice is doing to attract and engage new clientele. It sounds like Chewy is not having an issue here, but we're wondering, where do you bring in additional revenue? How do you participate in this? And I think that you need to be able to find a way to allow your clients to meet you in a place where they want to be. 80% of Chewy clients, again, I'm going to say this probably 40 times in this story, but 80% of their net sales were on auto ship. If your practice doesn't offer auto ship or subscriptions for the things that you can sell them, they're going to go to somebody that does. So really big stuff here. Congratulations to Chewy. It was a great quarter and a great year for them, and can't wait to see the continued growth for businesses that are trying something new in our industry. Finally, our last story carries on from some of the VPA story from last week. The National Association of Veterinary Technicians in America released their scope of practice report. The Veterinary Nurse Initiative Committee released this big report, and they did a survey of 50 different states and reviewed all of their veterinary practice acts, plus a survey of over 1,000 veterinary professionals. They say it's the most comprehensive look at the scope of practice that they've ever gotten. Ultimately, the headline here, though, was that there's no national standard for vet team members. Every state makes their own rules, and many don't make rules at all. They found that 19 jurisdictions have no defining scope for practice of veterinary technicians and veterinary nurses. 29 jurisdictions have no defined legal scope for practice for veterinary assistants. 31 jurisdictions have no legal language restricting tasks to credential staff. Even more crazy here, 47.2% of jurisdictions don't use either recommended models of supervisions from the AAVSB or the AVMA. And only 56% of respondents said their workplace consistently follows scope of practice laws. Nearly half say enforcement is unclear or non-existent. So this is something, we talk about people practicing at top of license and being able to do more with less. And how are you optimizing your team? Well, if you don't know what your team's allowed to do, you can't optimize with your team. So the paradox here is that most states, though, are requiring veterinary technicians to graduate from accredited programs and pass a licensing board. But the majority don't legally restrict any tasks to credentialed people. So a non-credential assistant can do a lot of the same work in many states, even though they're not licensed to do those things. Of the boards in the states and the people who regulate this, 91% say it's moderately to extremely important to restrict certain clinical tasks to credentialed professionals, but only 32% say their state actually does this. Some of the quotes from the study say, "I've been practicing for over a decade, and I still have to remind my leadership what I'm actually allowed to do." Another one said, "I put in years of education and passed the VTNE, but in my state, a non-credential assistant can legally do everything I do." People are in a spot here where they're going to school, they're getting debt from this school, they're going through the extra workload of getting this credentials and the education. And what we saw from NAVTA last week, even about the VPA, was saying this is work that needs to be done and this is education that needs to happen. But we're even adding in additional credentials and additional levels, but we don't have laws or rules in place or skills in place to be able to regulate what these people can actually do in a clinic. So it's kind of wild to think about this. There are states, though, that are doing a great job in the report. They said California, Ohio, Oregon, Virginia, and Washington all have extremely strong framework. Colorado, which has been a bit of a hot button issue around the credentialed technicians and veterinary professional associates, passed legislation in 2024 to define delegable tasks with the new veterinary technician specialist designation, which starts this year. And overall, the association had 6 recommendations. They said define the scope in all jurisdictions, use itemized task lists, adopt a dual list model for vet techs and veterinary associates, expand defined veterinary associate tasks, standardize the supervision levels, and strengthen knowledge and implementation at the practice level. So all things that we should be thinking about. Weave this whole together, right? Chewy is bringing in people. They're selling more things through their online store. You have people in clinic that can do certain things and are educated at an extremely high level to do more things than what someone maybe isn't educated or trained on doing specifically. Utilize the team you have to do more. Utilize technology to continue to retain the revenue that you have coming through your clinic, and continue to drive people to be interested, because people are going to vet clinics. They might not be spending as much as they were, but they are showing up. And gosh, bring it all the way back to the first story. If we can't figure out ways to do this, we're going to get completely ahead of our skis and be in the situation that the UK was, and have a regulatory body or a government agency do a multi-year investigation and come up with their own rules for us. So, is my soapbox getting worn out? Maybe it is, but this is a fun episode, and this is one that has a lot of things that I think should spur on some great conversations. And for more on these and other stories, you can always join us by subscribing to our Substack. There's a link in the bio. And don't miss out on any episodes by subscribing and rating the show. For The Bird Bath, I'm Ryan Leach. See you next week.